Hey everybody, John Shutsky here. We're going to talk about creativity in design for BSE 508. Now, I do recognize that I've already given you an assignment or two where I've asked you to brainstorm a little bit, to be creative, to begin looking at different types of options, different types of design solutions, whether it's for your whole design or maybe it's for a subsystem or a subcomponent. But I really want to get a little bit more formal today and talk to you about a philosophy, if you will, of creativity, or actually looking at some of the principles that go into creativity. And then a future lecture, I will also be talking about how you evaluate creative ideas. And it's a little bit of a dichotomy, right? Because you want to be creative without evaluating things. You want to get ideas out onto the table. You want to be engaging as many different people, as many different parts of your brain as you possibly can before you begin to narrow and focus. But this is an important part of the design process, to be able to think kind of wildly, to be able to think creatively. I'll have a technique at the end called Scamper, and I will link another video to the Scamper video, which is kind of a really critical technique in design thinking. But hopefully I'll in this lecture give you some philosophies that will be helpful in the future as you begin to think creatively and as you begin to work with your team. And that's an important part of it, is teamwork is something that can foster creativity if done correctly. So let me just start out. I've got a couple of sort of chunks that I'm going to talk about here, working across disciplines, and also 5 things that I want you to take away from this class in terms of productivity. First of all, working across disciplines. At universities, we're very discipline oriented, right? Like if we talk about working across disciplines, for people in engineering, that's kind of like a wild and crazy idea, like ME working with CE, or civil engineers working with BSE engineers. And I'm actually talking about working even further out of the boxes than working across engineering disciplines. I'm talking about engineers working with biologists, engineers working with astronomers, or with people who are pursuing a degree in business, or people who are journalists. These are the kinds of areas, these are the interfaces where a lot of the really cool stuff in the world happens, where biologists working with engineers discover new ways of delivering new vaccines through entirely new technologies, as an example. There are so many big, huge, complicated problems that so many of you are going to be working on in the future, in your future role as professional engineers. And I want you to feel comfortable in the notion that it is very okay. In fact, it's not only very okay, it's strongly encouraged that you find ways to think outside of your disciplinary box. There's been a lot of work done on this. In fact, a lot of writing in the last probably 5 to 10 years. This is from the journal, a peer-reviewed journal called Nature. Nature is actually one of the higher ranked journals in the world, and they did a whole issue that I'll link in the module in September of 2016 on the importance of interdisciplinary work teams, working across disciplines. As you see from the headlines here, interdisciplinarity, why scientists must work together to save the world, life without borders, a self-defense course, new technologies make sense of human immunity. So there's all different types of ways to think about interdisciplinarity. But again, what I'm talking about is not just the mechanical engineer working with the BSE engineer. I'm talking about working much more out of the box than that, and much more out of the silo. So where has this actually happened? So just one example, you see this used a lot. This is an example. If you go to the YouTube video, and I'll provide this specific link, this takes you to, it's a Steve Jobs graduation speech, I believe possibly Stanford University several years ago. And it starts at the 3-minute, 21-second mark, where he talks about the importance of getting out there, getting out of the box. And the famous story, Steve Jobs went to school at Reed College, a very small liberal arts college in Oregon, back in 1972. He went for a semester or two. I think he was pretty successful, but he decided it wasn't exactly what he wanted. He didn't want to waste his tuition money, but he ended up staying at Reed College. And one of the things that was very attractive, or it really caught his imagination, was that all of the signs on campus, all of the labeling, like signs in the library and the way file cabinets were labeled and things like that, they were all done in calligraphy. And one of the things about Reed College is they had this like world famous calligraphy curriculum where they taught people to use the graphic visual art of hand calligraphy. So he decided to, even though he had dropped out, he decided to go back and audit or sit in on a class in calligraphy. And if you think about that, so much of the early versions of the Jobs, Apple, Macintosh computers, the reason why they were so unique is these beautiful typefaces, these beautiful fonts that the Apple computer was able to generate before that really became a thing, like back in the 1980s and early 1990s. And that was largely because he decided to leave his academic program and go over and take a calligraphy class. And I'm not sure, I don't think his parents were real happy about that, but you get this idea that there's inspiration often that happens at the interface. He also worked on campus. This was his job application. I tend to I like looking at this because I'm such a stickler in my other class in BSE 308 to presenting yourself, making sure you're a good writer, that you fill things out, that you've got a good resume. And I like this little like 1 page or half page job application to Reed College probably back in the 1970s. So some thoughts I have and some questions I have for you as you work in BSE 508 and then in the future in 509, who else? What are some of the other disciplines that need to be at the table? I'm not going to name specific projects here, but you might want to think outside of the traditional engineering disciplines. You may need to have biologists. If you're working on a project that involves trees, you may want to have people who are knowledgeable about trees, whether they're horticulturalists or arborists or people who are in forest and wildlife ecology. You may again want to think beyond the borders of the department, beyond the borders of the engineering disciplines, and even think about people who work in the humanities, whether it's writing or journalism or philosophy. Those people may have a role to play in your project, both in 508, 509, and also when you get out into the real world in the future. So that's the importance of working across disciplines. Now I want to talk about 5 things that I want you to take away from this lecture, from this class in particular. Number 1, and I've already alluded to this, creativity and innovation will differentiate you in the marketplace. I guarantee if you are a person who can put these kinds of skills, creative thinking, brainstorming, coming up with new ideas, thinking out of the box, being able to build relationships and connect with other individuals, it will differentiate you as a potential candidate for jobs. And then when you get into the workplace, especially, that creativity and innovation will shine. You'll stand head and shoulders above other people because it's relatively rare to find these kinds of skills. This can happen to you as an individual. That's kind of what I'm hoping for, is that you can take these skills as an individual and apply them to your future. This can also happen as a company, right? Like a lot of the companies that we really love in this country and in this world, we love them because they're creative, because they're able to think out of the box. I'm not going to give lots of examples here, but we also know that in the case here recently of the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the reasons why we were able to overcome the pandemic through vaccines and the deployment of really effective vaccines was because of some really creative, innovative thinking about how vaccines would be delivered once they got into your bodies. That also includes the products we design, the products we deliver, the products we develop, your relationships with your customers, and most importantly, the difference that you make in people's lives. And I've tried to touch on that over and over and over again. When you're designing a product, when you're spending your time, your energy, your thoughts, your creativity, your problem-solving ability, hopefully in the future, you'll be doing that to make a difference in other people's lives. This is a really cool book. If you've ever get a chance just to even skim through this book, it's called Creativity, Inc. by Ed Catmull. And Ed Catmull is one of the original founders of Pixar. He said, in my experience, creative people discover and realize their visions over time. So that's really critical. This stuff takes time. It takes maturity. You'll become more confident in your ability and interest in being creative as you mature as an engineer up to a certain point. And then there's also a certain point where I believe that begins to dissipate to some extent. It also takes a dedicated, protracted a struggle. And I think about this in my case, the early part of my career, I did a lot of work from an engineering perspective to try to prevent injuries among children who were working on the farm. And I was looking at engineering approaches. I was trying to develop better means for educating young kids. And we really didn't begin to have success until we started to work more closely with people like pediatricians, doctors who take care of little kids, pediatric nurses, people who were experts in the theory of what we call child development. And it was a struggle. And it wasn't necessarily something that felt comfortable. I didn't feel confident in that originally, but I knew that I needed to reach out and begin to make those kinds of connections. So take the advice of creatives, even like somebody who works for Disney or Pixar or Steve Jobs. These are things that we do need to struggle through, but in the end, the results can be super effective and ultimately very elegant and even beautiful when they finally do occur, even though there's struggle in the background. Number 2 of my 5 points, creativity and innovation is discovered at the edges and overlaps. I talked a little bit about my work with engineering, with agriculture, with safety, with working with pediatricians. And I don't know for some of you if you can think of other examples. We've talked about Steve Jobs, Elon Musk. Think about Elon Musk. He's like a pioneer both in space, but he's also a pioneer with driverless cars, with electric cars. But then there's also the whole notion of battery technology. All of it is connected. There's these overlapping edges. One of the things that I think is helpful, how you can engender or you can bring out or unearth or mine this sense of creativity is through travel, by being outside, by being in the outdoors, by being around other people, by being around other cultures, other parts of the world, traveling to other countries. I also think that that's the beauty of things like art and music and doing a lot of reading. And as I talked about, it is something that we have to struggle through. Oftentimes when we see a product that's elegant, that's beautiful, like a Tesla, or like any type of Apple product, we're often unaware of the struggle and the work that went into it. It's a little bit like, a tapestry. You look at the backside of a beautifully, like a hand-stitched needlecraft tapestry. The backside is the picture on the right, but the front side, what you see on the surface, is beautiful. But realize that there's a lot that goes into it. There's a lot of overlap. There are a lot of knots. There are a lot of stumbles. There are a lot of twists and turns. But ultimately, that end product can be beautiful if you keep to it and if you focus on finding the best of the best through these overlapping disciplines and these overlapping ideas. That includes also the whole idea of diversity of thinking, diversity in terms of mixing it up with genders and ethnicities and cultures. Again, that's why travel, I believe, helps to open our minds to being more creative, to thinking about the world in a different way. It's about the ideas, it's about the relationships, and it's also about, in some cases, learning how other cultures have figured things out, how they have survived and thrived. I think about, China as an example. Our country, the United States, has been around now for 250 years approximately. A country like China has been around at least 10 times longer than that. So there are lessons to be learned, whether it is from China or a country on the African continent or in South America. We've got ancient cultures that we can often learn from and take the ideas and understand how they view the world and work with them so that we can bring some of those ideas and principles into our designs. Number 4 is working on a team is really critical. And that's why we've got you obviously working as a team here in BSE 508. But it's also really difficult. It's critical, but it's difficult. Engineers working with other people, you oftentimes have to overcome biases. Like if I go out and I do this, I work with medical doctors, I work with nurses, I work with people who are epidemiologists and veterinarians. And they've got really clear biases about me. Oh, I bet you're really good at math. And they're sometimes intimidated, anything that's quantitative or mathematical or anything that involves physics. And yet at the same time, we probably also carry those same biases when we work with other people, whether they're a journalist or a physicist. We need to make sure that we're relating to them as people. Their science is often secondary, but we need to make sure that we're clear in our communications, open-minded, we're good listeners, and that we really do take the time to build those relationships. So teamwork takes time. Strive for communication early, often. Strive for clarity, and just do lots and lots and lots of listening. And oftentimes what you'll find is that the people who you want to work with in other disciplines to solve problems are more similar to you than what you might ever imagine. Another thing just to ask you to think about when we think about working on or in a team setting is this whole idea of everybody trying to get more or less on the same page. If you think about solving a big, complicated, global, wicked problem, as might be represented by the big blocky blue arrows in this slide or in this chunk of video here, the big block arrows obviously recommend or suggest a big issue that we're working toward. My guess is that you've all worked with a team or on a team where you've got alignment, like you might see on the right-hand side, where each individual vector is more or less heading in the same direction. But you've probably also worked on team projects like on the left-hand side where people aren't aligned. You've got vectors, you've got individual people. Individual people are the small white arrows inside the big blue blocky arrow. And you've got people going in all different kinds of directions. They may not understand the big problem that you're moving toward. They might be purposely being disruptive. They might be kind of slow to engage. They may not be doing their homework or the background research necessary. So one of the things that you will do in the future and that you can be doing on your teams now and also in BSE 509 is making sure that you're doing the things necessary to align those vectors. You're never going to get everybody in perfect alignment like you see on the right-hand side, on the right-hand arrow, but the idea is to get as many of those vectors, as much energy moving in the right direction as possible so that you have an effective solution at the end. Number 5, workplaces. So if you're talking about individual companies, agencies, nonprofit organizations, companies, universities, workplaces in their cultures differ. They vary greatly in terms of their cultures related to creativity and innovation. Now, I will say this. Agriculture tends to be relatively conservative. I don't want to say that agriculture is not creative and not innovative, but we do need to see more people moving into the agricultural and the food sector who can think out of the box, who can think creatively. I've talked about this in other classes, or you've heard me allude to this here in this class. We have these really big challenges ahead of us in BSE, in food, in our environment, in terms of tackling this issue of climate change, a whole bunch of different problems, feeding 9.5 billion people, dealing with health, dealing with the future pandemics that are likely to occur, and the security that is necessary in a developing world. And we just really can't do this without people being thoughtful, creative, working across disciplines, and being willing to engage and adopt more of a creative culture. I do have some cautions for you in this class. I want you to be careful to not constrain your thinking. I would love to have you maybe push back gently with your advisors. In some cases, they're going to have very specific things they want you to do. And I think it's okay to challenge that a little bit. Don't constrain your thinking too much. Also, think about where there are pinch points or problem points. When you get out into the real world, you're going to be looking for opportunities to put your design skills to work. So oftentimes we often talk about necessity as the mother of invention. That's where real creative things happen. That's where Bill Gates got his start, Steve Jobs, John F. Kennedy sending the first group of people in the Apollo space program to land on the moon. He thought that that was absolutely the most necessary thing that we needed to do back in the early 1960s. My Woodman's List. So I've put together my own little app for when I go shopping at Woodman's. And the reason for that, the reason why I needed something, that I needed to develop something that I could use when I go shopping at Woodman's West, is because I was wasting an extra 2 hours of my week every week grocery shopping. So think about the things that are necessary. Think about where there are points of friction, where there are problems to be solved, where there are inconveniences that can be overcome. Another thing that I would encourage you to do, I often, personally, I really try to resist thinking that all engineers are introverts or that all sales and marketing people are extroverts. I think by labeling people, by stereotyping people in those kinds of boxes, oftentimes it can be stifling for some people. And this has been particularly something that I have had to work on myself. I guess I grew up feeling that I was very introverted, that I was very quiet, that I was very shy. And that actually sort of inhibited me in terms of working in some areas that I eventually grew comfortable working in. But it is something to think about, and I'll talk about that in a future conversation. I would highly recommend, there's a book called Please Understand Me. Highly recommend it if you would like to see it. I've got multiple copies of the book, but it talks about this whole notion of playing to our strengths and overcoming some of the labels we often think about. These are some factors. There are 6 here, some supports for creative thinking. This comes from a fairly widely adopted engineering design textbook by Dieter and Schmidt. Number 1, a lot of creativity is about having a creative attitude, having an open mind, having the self-confidence to work across disciplines, to work across domains, to work in the setting of a team, to be able to, within your team, bringing those creative ideas to the table. Unlocking your imagination. Don't take no for an answer. That's one of the things that bothers me the most, to be in a meeting and to be talking about how we might brainstorm, come up with a new solution on an issue, whether it's an administrative problem or a personnel problem, to be told no because we've never done it that way before. Try to overcome that type of thinking. Be persistent. Remember that Thomas Edison, the inventor of the light bulb, tried and failed with more than 6,000 different materials before he came up with the appropriate type of filament for a light bulb. And 6,000 is a lot of persistence. That's a lot of time spent. That's a lot of remember the backside of the needle, the needle art or the stitching art. There's a lot of ugliness. We all see Edison. We think of him as the ultimate inventor of all times, but he went through a lot of pain and a lot of struggle to get to those final designs. Develop with an open mind. I've talked about this. Consider all sources, all disciplines. Suspend judgment. Try to get all ideas out onto the table. Let me just repeat that again. Get all ideas out and onto the table for BSE 508 and 509. You'll have a chance later to evaluate those ideas, but the more you can bring to the table, the more creative you can be, the more you try to kind of bring the best of the best to the table, the better off you're going to be. Set problem boundaries and definition. That's the flip side of this. You need to get as many ideas onto the table, but they do need to be consistent with the problem, with the issue, with the question that you're trying to answer, or the problem that you're trying to solve through your design efforts. So those are enablers. Here's some blocks to creative thinking: stereotyping, stereotyping people, stereotyping ideas, stereotyping disciplines, also information overload, and disorganization. So that again is why we feel so strongly that having a good design notebook is so important. Fixation on one solution. Again, this is where I'm going to ask you to maybe somewhat gently push back against your advisor or advisors who might be fixated on a single solution. Don't be afraid to take a risk. Be okay with a little bit of chaos during your brainstorming sessions. Bring as many ideas to the table. Be willing to incubate new ideas. Be motivated. Make sure you do your homework. That's on the right-hand side where it says insufficient knowledge about the problem and potential solutions. So some of you are going to need to do some additional homework this summer before you decide on your final design solutions. Make sure you have accurate information. Make sure you have a comfortable physical environment to work in. Also that you're well fed, that you're well nourished, that you're hydrated, that physically you're ready to take on the task of being a creative designer. And also be thick-skinned. Don't accept criticism or be careful how you accept criticism. And also be careful how you give criticism or constructive feedback to other people. That's one of the reasons why in this class, when I do have you comment on other people's work, I would like for you to be constructive. I would like for you to give feedback that's helpful, that builds on the ideas of other people rather than ripping it apart, because that ripping apart, number one, it creates a degree of toxicity. And number two, it really tends to stifle or block creative thinking. So brainstorming, a lot of you are going to probably spend time in this class doing brainstorming. You've probably already done some of this. We want you to get your creative ideas onto the table, onto a whiteboard, onto paper. No evaluation. All ideas are good. You might do like mashups. You might combine ideas. You might combine concepts, taking the best from the best, but ultimately getting as many people, as many thoughts and ideas and creativity onto the table as possible. I believe this is my second to my last slide here. I'm actually going to ask you to watch another video on the Scamper technique. So we've got brainstorming. Everybody understands brainstorming. When you do brainstorming, there's no such thing as a bad idea. You get it all onto the table, you capture it. But then Scamper is another technique. It stands for substituting one idea or one past approach with a new approach, combining things, combining ideas, combining approaches, modifying, magnifying, or minifying approaches, putting your ideas to other uses. Are there new ways to use this as it is? What if I modify it? Also eliminating constraints, removing parts, features, functions, etc., without having an adverse effect. And then finally, rearranging or reversing. So I didn't do a very good job with that on Scamper. I would encourage you to watch the video. The Scamper technique is one that's fun to use. I think you'll have a fun time watching the video by the other person who does. He teaches a lot on design thinking, and the Scamper technique is one of those techniques. When we talk about refining and evaluating brainstorm ideas, there's a lot of things that you're going to come up with that are feasible as is. There may be some ideas that you generate through brainstorming or doing something like Scamper that has potential or that will have potential in your design that may need a little bit more refinement or a little bit more research. You may have other ideas that are wild and wacky, but there may be some element of it that you could pull out, that you could refine, that you could change, or it's just maybe some little subcomponent of an idea. If you flesh it out further and you extract that one idea, that may be where the real nugget of innovation actually occurs. So that's a little bit on creativity and innovation. I encourage you to use these concepts, use these thoughts as you go through the process here in BSE 508 and 509. And I really do look forward to seeing what you do come up with.